Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Pink Dandelion. I'm part of the learning and research team at Woodbrook, which is the Quaker Study Centre based in Birmingham, England. And I also work for the University of Birmingham as a professor of Quaker Studies. My meeting is Clitheroe meeting, which is right by Pendle Hill. So if I look out of my house, out of the other window, I'm looking at Pendle Hill, and it's a very nice area to be in. And I should just say that my meeting this morning had about 12 of us there, which is good going following the pandemic. So, but we know each other pretty well. We then had an hour and a half of fellowship before a little bit of learning ourselves this afternoon. So it feels like a very nice Quaker community to be a part of. So the title of this session is called The Heart of the Quaker Way. I'm obviously going to talk a little bit from my British experience. I plan to talk for probably about half an hour, and then we'll see if there's comments, reflections, questions, and we'll see how we go, and we will finish by 5 o'clock. So in Britain, we have a very high rate of people coming in. About 90% of us in Britain Yearly Meeting have come in as adults, which is phenomenal. I mean, at one level, that's the best conversion rate since the 1650s, I would have thought. At the same time, we do have falling numbers that are deaths and exits, outnumber our new members. And as such, we also have what might be called a labour shortage, because we have not managed to radically reduce the number of posts, of office holders, in line with our new demographic. But we are working on that, and a lot of meetings are engaged with simplification process, doing perhaps role audits and job audits, and saying, well, what do we actually need to make the meeting run? Do we need so many people on so many committees? So it's a time of transition, I think, for Quakerism in Britain. We've also gone through some theological shifts. We could look back at our Book of Discipline in 1959, and it's clearly Christian. It was called the Christian Book of Discipline. The 1994 book, the one we're using at the moment, Quaker Faith and Practice, has Christian relegated to the subtitle and is far less Christocentric. It's far more theocentric, in a sense. And probably in the last 2 decades, we've had an increasing number of people who would identify as non-theist, which is a term which covers a whole range of positions, from those who just find the term God difficult, but have a rich spiritual life and a clear sense of something other than the material, through to agnostics and atheists and humanists. So the term non-theist isn't always very helpful, but it is certainly current in many of the conversations that we're having in Britain. And we've just embarked on our own revision process for a Book of Discipline, but we felt we could only really do that once we'd overcome some of the tensions between those who identified as non-theists and the rest, who sometimes get called theist, but also might sometimes call themselves non-theist. So I don't get too technical. And we feel we've done that. We've managed to accommodate this diversity. That feels a very positive position to be in. Though it struck me recently and in conversations at my meeting that one of the ways we've managed to do that is by not really talking very much to each other about what we really believe and what we really experience. And the genesis of my talk today really comes out of an ongoing tension that we have around what do we say if someone asks us what a Quaker is? And I don't know if that's a problem you have in Philadelphia, but it's some people's worst nightmare. You know, like, what if the new inquirer comes up to me and says, so what is all this Quakerism about? What tends to happen in Britain is that we might point to the clerk or someone on ministry and council, or offer them a leaflet, or suggest having a look at the Book of Discipline, you know, read your way into Quakerism, or ask somebody else. Or we might say, well, for me, it's this. And we answer in purely individual terms that doesn't really help the inquirer understand, you know, whether that's generic or typical or just someone's idiosyncratic version of Quakerism. So what I want to do is present 4 key elements of what I think the Quaker way, what's at the heart of the Quaker way. And I'll give you the list of 4, and then I'll go through them one by one. So the list of 4 begins with the idea and the experience, indeed, that we can all have a direct encounter with the divine. And by divine, please translate that to your preferred term, whether it's God, spirit, light. But that basically we believe as friends that we can have this direct encounter. We don't need to go through anybody else. We don't need to go through any text. And that each one of us as such is a minister, one to another, and as such a community of ministers. The second element, though, is that we've found over time that if we come together to worship in our particular way, that experience of the divine can be nurtured and deepened and strengthened, in some ways made more reliable. Thirdly, we would need to say that discernment is absolutely central to Quakerism, because if we're a group that say we're led by the Spirit, we need to know when we truly are led by the Spirit and not just by imagination or pride or will. And fourthly, that there's a very particular life that comes out of this experience of the Spirit, that we don't you know, engage in the spiritual life and remain unchanged by it. It is a transformative and transforming experience, and as a consequence of that, our lives are likely to change and move in particular directions in line with our historic testimony. So those are the 4 elements. It's encounter, it's worship and ministry, it's discernment, and it's witness. And these 4 elements are what I'm placing and suggesting are the heart of the Quaker way. So I'm just going to run through these. Is that list clear for everybody? We're okay up to now? Just please do wave or interrupt if there's anything that's unclear, or if my accent is proving troublesome. So good, thanks. So the first thing is the direct encounter with the Spirit. We can go right back to the beginning of Quakerism, to what I would say 1647, where George Fox relates that he was in a very low place. His hopes in all men, in all people were gone. He had nothing outwardly to help him. And then, oh then, he hears a voice which says, there is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to your condition. And he said, when I heard it, my heart did leap for joy. Then I could see why there was none upon the earth that might speak to my condition, namely that I might give him all the glory. And all are concluded in sin and shut up in unbelief, as I had been. What he discovers at that moment is this really powerful sense of direct relationship. Interestingly as well, he doesn't think it's confined to him. One of the ways we could look at the history of Christianity is say, well, there's been a long list of prophets who say, well, I've got something very particular and you need to listen to me. In some ways he does say that, but he also says that this experience is available for everybody. And more than that, he feels that this is the way that everyone should be in relationship with God. So for almost 200 years, Quakers claim that we really have it right, that we are the true church. Not something that we necessarily say today. Today, we're more likely to say we're one option amongst many and none. But that really strong sense of a new and right way of being in relationship with God. And the corollary of that is that all the other Christians had got it wrong in some way, or were at least slightly out of kilter. And Fox and the other early Quaker converts, put a lot of energy into telling other people how wrong they are and how right Quakerism is. It's got all that energy and excitement of certainty and of a movement of youth who are absolutely convinced they're right. So a very powerful experience, one not confined to Fox, one that he is very clear is available to everybody. And really, almost immediately, you then get this really strong sense of radical equality, that we are all ministers together in this, that nobody is beyond God's grace, nobody is beyond the love of God, nobody should be beyond our care and our love. And from that, we can see really the whole of testimony emerging out of that, including very strongly and unusually at the time, the clarity not to fight in the civil war that was going on at the time. So it's strong, it's powerful, it can happen in any place at any time. So Margaret Fell is in church and she's listening to George Fox preach, and she has a kind of convincement experience. She breaks down, she first of all stands up in wonder at his message about it being about an inward spirituality. And then she breaks down in tears, claiming that we've all been thieves who've just somehow stolen the scriptures, in a way gone through the motions of being a Christian without really understanding the substance. And so she is then converted to Quakerism. James Naylor's at the plough when God tells him to leave home and he resists it, and then he is given another strong sense. So what we get is a lot of individual experiences that in some ways we might think, well, people could just then go back to the farm and, I'm okay with God now. I'll just, but there's something about this experience that draws people together, pushes people away from their homes to join the new movement, to become part of what will become known as Quakerism. And as Francis Howgill says, we were gathered as in a net, and we knew a place to stand in and what to wait in. There's something very powerful and gathering about this direct spiritual encounter. It's not just an individual experience that leaves us to our own devices. So what's important, I suppose, to bear in mind is that there were no meeting houses initially. There weren't any need for them. Friends would meet in each other's homes or in barns. Meeting houses come later, but also that meeting houses are never theologically very important. They're useful. They're not blessed or sacred, or because this spiritual experience can happen anywhere and everywhere. And similarly, that every time is equally important. So every day of the week is important, every moment of every day of the week. So the Quakers initially do not celebrate Christmas and Easter because every day is like Christmas and Easter. And it's only in the 20th century, again, through large numbers of people coming in, that we've tended to then initially culturally celebrate these festivals, and then in certain cases celebrate them religiously as well. So what we can say is Quakerism is set up on a very grand claim that we don't need any of the mechanisms that other Christians have found to be helpful and important over the centuries. What we've said is that we can just have a direct encounter with God without any intermediary of person or text, without anyone else around, that we don't need a building with any decoration or altar or front or outward sacrament, that we will experience an inward sacramental life. So other Christians take communion because it says in 1 Corinthians 11:26, break the bread till the Lord comes again. Fox says the Lord has come again. We don't need to break the bread. In fact, he then refers to Revelation 3:20, which claims that those who hear me knock, I will come and sup inwardly. He said that is our communion. So what basically Quakers are doing as well is moving the kind of Christian timeline into the book of Revelation. They feel like they're living, early friends are living in the end times, and they're full of that kind of sectarian certainty and excitement. So over time, this will moderate and change, and we will get into other ways of being that for a time will involve wearing particular forms of dress, speaking in a very particular way, and then we will come out of that into the state we're in now, which is much more relaxed about how we are in the world, feeling that we can be authentic and sincere without any outward forms. In some ways, we return to the focus on the inward, without, though, the claim that we are the true church. So, okay. So we've basically got a church of ministers, and we then have choices about how to worship. One of the ways we could have started off is say, well, why don't we have a rota? You know, we're all ministers, we'll take it in turns. You know, Rich, you do next week, Michael, and then Patricia, and then Ellen, and we'll just go round, and you know, you take it away how you want, because you're a minister, and you know, let's go for it. But one of the other insights was that actually one of the best ways to nurture this experience of God was through stillness and silence. Just sitting quietly doing nothing, God came, God broke into our lives. You know, Fox is probably on a tree stump in the middle of England in 1647. Naylor, I said, was at the plough. You know, Howgill's walking through Sedbergh. You know, it's just things happen when you're actually not doing very much. It's almost that absence can lead to a strong sense of presence. And many of the Quakers had been seekers beforehand, and seekers had already started to meet in silence. They usually had a minister who would speak at a particular point, but they'd already so stripped away all the, you know, the liturgy of the Church of England that they were meeting in silence. And it may be that some of those, you know, that experience influenced early Quaker worship. So instead of having a rota or a roster, basically we're saying, okay, we'll just settle down into silence and stillness, and we'll see what happens. This amazing experiment in faith, and we'll just take it away. And in the 1650s, it would have been for 3 hours. There's a story of a 9-hour meeting, but typically a 3-hour worship. And now some meetings are experimenting with that again. You may be familiar with Marcel Martin's Pendle Hill pamphlet, Invitation to a Deeper Communion. Just as we begin to realize that we've shortened worship by about half an hour a century, and that maybe we're losing something by doing that. And so some meetings are experimenting again with longer worship or untimed worship, and seeing what experience that gives us. But there we are, we're basically still saying we need to worship together, we need to come to a particular place at a particular time, This will deepen our experience. It will make it more reliable. It will help nurture the sense of the Spirit in our lives. So, and again, perhaps in a rather grand claim, we've said again, we can just go into the room, sit down, and we'll hopefully get to that place. Okay? We don't need any help in moving from the everyday, which we hope is Spirit-filled, into a deep worshipping life. We will, no doubt, have personal strategies to help us come to meeting with heart and mind prepared. We may, I've heard people talk about people driving a particular route or not driving, or reading only a particular bit of the newspaper, or reading a devotional book or not reading the newspaper, listening to a particular kind of music and not listening to music at all. But whatever our own way to worship is, that we will have a strategy to help us deepen that experience. And when we get there, we may also have strategies. It may be our meeting has a reading at the start of worship, or that we go through an individual process. Again, I've heard people talk about looking around the room, seeing who's there, holding people in the light, or a personal kind of guided meditation to go into a deeper place. Worship's been described to me as akin to a jar of pickled vegetables, one of those with the many layers, and we go through the carrots and then down into the cucumbers, and that somehow has different levels and layers of silence. And initially we might be a bit fidgety in our chair, and then we realize that we're the most fidgety person there, and that will help us still ourselves. And then the meeting may go into a deeper silence, and then a deeper silence, and ministry may add to that depth of worship. And if we're really fortunate, we may experience a covered meeting or a gathered meeting, where that experience of deep worship is shared throughout the group. On other days, it might work for some of us and not for others. And one person I spoke to recently said, well, one meeting in every 100 worked for them. It was so dramatic, it kept them coming for the next 2 years. So always that possibility, that experiment, that laboratory of the Spirit, which we engage in. So, but again, I mean, if we went to a program meeting, we might find that they're less sure of just being able to sink into the silence, into that deep worshipping space. So some of the pastors I've spoken to say, well, the message and the music is to help us prepare for the open worship. It's to help us be ready for communion after the manner of friends. And that helped me understand a little bit more about how some evangelical friends were understanding their Quaker faith. They may spend less time in silence, but they were certainly centering their worship around that in an interesting way. As I say, we might experiment with having a reading at the start of meeting to help us move from the everyday into the worshipping space. My meeting also has themed worship when there's a 5th Sunday in the month, as there was today, where we might pick a topic and contribute on that topic, or set up a sharing exercise, or do some artwork in the worship. Always optional, of course, but it initially began as a kind of a desire to be inclusive of people of any age. And we've kept it going even though we don't have many young people coming now. So out of the worship may come vocal ministry. So our Book of Discipline in Britain suggests that it should add to the worship. That we may not, it would be helpful if we weren't moved to speak right at the beginning or right at the end, that we wouldn't speak more than once, that we wouldn't speak immediately after somebody else. Basically, kind of pragmatic cautions around it getting too busy or too much popcorn ministry. There's no good theological reason why God wouldn't give us 2 messages in an hour. And of course, it was said that Fox would minister for an hour. But these are ways just to help us remember what we're about. And that in some sense that the silence and stillness are more important than speech. Speech may help, ideally will help, but if in doubt, our British Book of Discipline says, if in doubt, don't. In my local meeting with up to 12 people, we say, if in doubt, do, because we'd actually like to hear a bit more of what's happening for people, what they feel they're being given to share. So, again, if you go to a program friend's church, you might find a flow chart around whether or not to minister in their open period of open worship. Is this message from God? Yes, no. Is this message from God for this meeting? Yes, no. Is this message from God for this meeting for today? Yes, no. Is this message from God for this meeting for today for me to share? And it's amazing how often people say, I was on the verge of offering ministry when someone else stood up and gave a very similar message. And again, this points away from this sort of idea that we're just individuals in meeting, that there is something collective and intentional and active happening when we gather together. So, but we will sometimes be given ministry to share. Some of us may go through that kind of discernment process with the checklist. Typically, though, we might also just find ourselves on our feet, potentially reluctantly, but nevertheless on our feet, sharing something we may not fully remember afterwards. One of the most frequent ministers in my meeting feels so uncomfortable sharing ministry. Resists it, finds herself on her feet, does not remember what was said afterwards, and is then kind of used, spent, exhausted at the end. So it's a visceral bodily experience. We are, after all, Quakers who used to quake, and it can be a very uncomfortable experience as well. So one of the things that we might think about in that regard is, in Britain, we often say, well, thank you for your ministry, or found your ministry very helpful. And recently I was speaking to a conservative friend from the conservative tradition, and they would say, thank you for being faithful to the words you were given. So the ministry is coming through us. We are just the channel. And that may help us when we're feeling we should resist, the call to minister, because actually it's not about us. We need to remember to be trying to be faithful to what we're given to share. And then we needn't feel worried about being proud or self-aggrandizing because we've ministered for 2 weeks in a row, because again, it's not about us. We're just the vehicle for the ministry that the meeting hopefully will gain help from. So sometimes we may need to interrupt ministry. That's not an easy job if it is from God, to discern whether this person needs to be asked to stop. It happens very rarely. I mean, one of the other wonders to me of Quaker worship is how reliable it is, how little abused that big open space is. But in a really busy city centre meeting, it may be that people just walk in and there's an open space and a captive audience. I was at a meeting once where somebody spoke, when they spoke the third time, someone from ministry and council just carried on the conversation in another room. So not an easy judgment to make, though, when we sense that ministry is from God. So, which really leads us then into discernment, which was the third element. Here we are, a group of ministers gathering together for worship, but also ideally led by the Spirit throughout our lives. And we need to discern then what is truly from God or the Spirit. You know, if we're making this claim that we're not just a Sunday morning religion and we're trying to live in that space, then discernment becomes very central. Now, traditionally, we talked about discerning the will of God. As I say, for some non-theists, that would be a difficult term because they wouldn't have a God. For others of us, we might not have a God that has a will. We might learn as God does or as Spirit does. But for some people, we are still trying to live in that space of seeking guidance from beyond ourselves. And for some Quakers, that will involve just about every decision. You know, what do I do next? Am I doing this? What's right? And we do become practiced at it, I think. We become, attuned to knowing when we're doing the right thing or things are feeling in right ordering, that we are being faithful and authentic, and when we're not. So, I know that if things are getting a little bit overly complicated or stressed or I'm rushing, I'm probably outrunning my guide, maybe doing things on my own will or imagination or pride. When the spiritual dominoes fall into place, calmly, peacefully, energetically, that things don't need masses of rearranging, that feels like a rightly led decision. The other help I may use is the question that the Amish use, which is, does this build community? And I've used that very helpfully to try and work my way through a difficult personal decision. Does this build community? I have a weakness for wheels and anything really with wheels, bicycles, motorbikes, cars. And there have been moments where I've been tempted to buy something. And I thought, well, does this build community? Well, it's about putting the family into debt. No, it's only me that's going to enjoy it. So no, and it's probably harming the environment more than I really want to. So no. And so that question I found very, very helpful indeed. When we come together as meetings, though, we also need to utilize, our well-practiced centuries of discernment. We've got good processes to help us work through business meeting or meeting for worship for church affairs. Good practices of discerning on the matter and then discerning on the minute. And hopefully clerks who are able to help manage our discernment processes without getting overly involved in the matter itself. It's a real skill that whilst we, the body, are discerning an item, they're discerning the process that is going to help our discernment. And it isn't an easy process, and we should always be grateful for a good clerk. And then the minute is written and agreed in the meeting. It has an authority of being the discernment of the meeting. And for me, nowhere is it more impressively practiced than at yearly meeting, where this year we had over 1,000 friends gathered, and we're following the same kind of process that we would do in my local meeting with maybe 7 of us at business meeting. And if anything, the larger numbers help the discipline. They help us remember what we're about. They help us remember what it is to offer ministry, and not just a bright idea or a response to what someone else has just said. If it's already been said, it doesn't need saying again. We're moving in a singular direction. It's not like a regular worldly business meeting where we may be seconding or voting or backing up or supporting. We're seeking the right thing to do. And again, it doesn't necessarily need a load of words. What it needs is the practice of expectant waiting and disciplined discernment. Okay, I'm moving swiftly on to the fourth thing, and that's the life that comes out of our spiritual experience. Now, we have a friend in my meeting who says, he's been a Quaker 10 years, and he said, well, actually, my life hasn't changed. I kind of came this way, and I mean, we have seen such a change in him since he came, let alone what his family tells us about how he was before. So whilst it's felt to him like a seamless process in which he has always been a Quaker, really, we've noticed all kinds of ways of, changing his car into a more economical model, changing the way he makes decisions, testing things with friends in the meeting. There's no doubt in my mind that Quakerism has changed his life, and it has in mine. I came to Quakerism as a highly confrontational anarchist. I'd bring vegan food to the potluck, and it would say the real pacifist option. It was like almost wanting a fight in the meeting, come outside, you vegetarians. Had an awkward haircut with, different colors in it. I had this strange, awkward name. I was ready to take on these pacifists anyway and show them what a real pacifist was. And I think I've gained compassion and humanity and understanding and being alongside, hopefully more. And, I look back in an embarrassed way, and I look back with thanks for the patience of all the wise friends who just bore with me as this super zealous inquirer. But there's ways in which we are sometimes already attuned to the Quakerism that we come into, things we're already doing, and we do kind of come home, in some way. We find people. One friend said to me, I found people who were as weird as I was, and then again, that their weirdness, in a very positive sense, helped me stay weird during the week, because we know we're not alone. We may not agree on every issue or every strategy, but we know there's a body of people there in our meeting who are trying to live as we're trying to live. We're trying to get it right spiritually and politically and practically. And we'll be in different places on the whole range of issues. So if we take sustainability and climate justice, for example, my monthly meeting decided to set up a thing called Small Steps for Sustainability. And we got into threes, and we just said, what's your next small step? Now, one of us had been recycling for 20 years, but somebody had only just started doing certain kinds of recycling. So that was their next small step. And there was no judgment, and it was just about supporting each other wherever we were on this journey of sustainability. And I think in the sense that is really what we're about at our best, is about a community of care and support to help us move in a similar direction, even when we're not all in exactly the same place, that we can discern a direction and we can move towards it and not judge each other, not get into the confrontation that I wanted to back in the mid-80s. So we do have this kind of list of testimonies, which is maybe very helpful when we're trying to explain Quakerism to newcomers, and it can get kind of abbreviated into spice or spices or steps or any one of these things. I'm a little concerned about the list. I mean, it does have a teaching value, but my concern is that it can make us separate out different elements of really what is a singular testimony about trying to be faithful to our tradition of witness. That I've heard someone say, well, I'm strong on peace, but I have a problem with simplicity. Or vice versa, I'm strong on simplicity, but I'm really not sure about peace. And it's almost as if these things are separated out and we can pick and choose the ones we want. What, again, we're trying to do is live the authentic life together in a singular direction. If we go back to the 18th century and look to the 1800s and look to the Book of Discipline there, it's all testimony. It's about how to dress, how to mourn the dead, how to have gravestones or not have gravestones, how to treat other people, how to get married in a particular way. And for that, I mean, in a sense, we still have a complete way of life that for me doesn't reduce down to a little list of 5 things. So I'll just throw that in on my soapbox. And but we do have a way of life that is strengthened and supported through our Quaker communities. And again, we're not left to our own devices. So sometimes you may hear Quakerism is a do-it-yourself religion. All of those 4 elements, encounter, worship, discernment, and witness, they all work so much better when we're doing it together. We are a do-it-together religion. We are a collective faith. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother coming to worship. We wouldn't need to discern together. In fact, you know, somehow we'd be on some kind of spiritual autopilot and we'd know it all. And again, we would just do our own thing in terms of witness. You know, operations like FCNL and AFSC have worked because we come together as a collection of yearly meetings and meetings within those yearly meetings to make things happen. And we always need to remember that we're not alone, even in our individual daily, day-to-day decision making, but we're part of this huge, wonderful web of Quakerism that has survived 370 years and is, to my mind, looking very strong. Our numbers may be falling occasionally. We may be lacking a little bit of confidence about saying what it is to be a Quaker. We can change that tomorrow. We can change the way we present our Quakerism at the meeting and change our notice boards and change our leaflets so they're more accessible. We can do anything that we need to do and that we're led to do. We can change the way we worship, make it longer, shorter, mix it up a bit, have some singing occasionally, whatever is going to help us lead the authentic life. Bearing in mind that at the heart of the Quaker way is our understanding that everybody can have a direct experience of the Spirit. So, okay, I went a little more over half an hour. I'm going to stop there to see if there's comments or questions. That we're not very many. You could probably unmute and just say something if you'd like to. So questions, comments, reflections, disagreements, always welcome.
I've never heard of such a title. Are you the only one, or are there a whole lot of people with Quaker
there are 3 of us. It's a pretty niche market, Quaker Studies. But there's Stephen Angel at Earlham School of Religion. He is the Geraldine Leatherrock Professor of Quaker Studies. Okay. And you have David Watt at Haverford, who is a Professor of Quaker Studies.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah. And Swarthmore used to have a Professor of Quaker Studies, but I think they've changed the title now. Sorry. Yes, you're down as Craig. But...
All I can say is I grew up in the class with Frederick Tolles.
Oh, right.
At Swarthmore High School.
Okay, fantastic. Yes. So there are many Quaker Studies academics who are also professors, but they just aren't always called professors of Quaker Studies. So, anyway.
Is it a very popular class? Do you teach a lot of people?
No, I don't teach very much at all. We mainly supervise PhD students and master's students by research. So I'm mainly involved in one-to-one conversations with people doing research. So, but the classes at Earlham are buzzing, so that's good. They do an MA in, Quakerism and Quaker theology. So, yeah.
Wow. That's great.
So if any of you want to do a PhD, do get in touch.
do you remember any of your steps along the way from being a pugnacious vegan to being more calm now?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, one of the things that happened was that I really came into Quakers as an ex-anarchist. So I've been living at a peace camp, which is where we all changed our names, and I had the pink hair and veganism and all kinds of other things. And I got arrested a lot and then began to lose faith that there would be a revolution in England. It was there was a high point of zeal in 1984. There was a miners' strike, but it was all just squashed. And so I looked around for another organization that was trying to change the world within the system. And I had been to a Quaker school, so I knew the Quakers, and here was a group that looked a little bit like the anarchists. No votes, no leaders, peace. And so I started going to meeting. And I became a member after about 6 months, partly because the meeting said, oh, you've been to a Quaker school. That's okay, you'll know everything. Well, actually, I knew very little. And then, though, I got a kind of a scholarship to come to Philadelphia and did some study in the libraries at Haverford and Swarthmore, and then went on a Greyhound bus trip out to San Francisco. And on the way back, needed to change my ticket because the Labor Day schedule was changed after Labor Day. And I needed to buy another ticket, and the only way I could do that was by begging in the bus station in Denver. And what you go up to people, you say, hi, I really need some money. I'm a Quaker. You can trust me. And I'll tell you, it doesn't get you anywhere. So, but what I did manage to do is find someone else from Britain who I managed to convince to buy me a ticket on his credit card. And I gave him every dollar and cent I had, and then carried on got my new ticket and carried on my bus journey to New York. And outside St. Louis, then had this incredible experience of being kind of lifted up and held and looked after. And I was a pretty happy kind of agnostic, really. I wasn't looking for, I wasn't feeling in need, but this was a very strong sense. And because I'd been brought up as an atheist, I really had no other word for it than God. So I say I was lifted up and held by God. And that sort of sense of having an accompanied life has never really totally gone away, which is a great joy and privilege. But what that meant is that suddenly Quakerism made a whole lot more sense, because I could understand why we were spending so long in silence, especially in those long business meetings. And I had a sense of the spiritual. So maybe I was admitted into membership too soon, but that changed a lot for me, because I could see that we were really all trying to head in the same direction. And I think, again, just over time, and I've become the kind of person I probably would have been very critical of in my 20s. I, own a house and got married, and I'm a parent, and, it looks like I'm just like a regular Pink Dandelion. And, but I think there is something about becoming more moderate over time, because you have a greater sense of compassion for all conditions. And it's not just about winning or losing. So that was a long answer to a question.
Oh, Lord. Anyway, I like what you said about, use the term, the sense of the spirit. Mm-hmm. Sense of the spirit. And those words shot out at me, because I think that maybe it feels like a secret revealed, that instead of trying to explain and talk about the spirit as if it's something that if we talk enough, it'll become materialized in some way, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm going to take that with me. I thank you for those words, because I'm going to take it with me And as we move into our own, this is our vacation time. We start up again in September with certain things. I'm going to be thinking about that hard.
Good.
Because we're ready for newness, a new way of thinking about, of doing our own sense of what the Quakers really are about in the first place. So thank you.
We have an amazing freedom as a group of men. I mean, it can be awfully frustrating because everyone gets to have a say, and nobody can make an easy, quick decision necessarily. But at the same time, we've got great strength in our collective wisdom and our ability to go in any direction we want to, because nothing is set in stone, in a sense. I mean, we haven't got a pope that's like laying it down, or we don't have to follow a particular book of common prayer or anything. I mean, we have the freedom to follow the spiritual guidance we're given. So it's amazing. Yes, Susanna?
For me, I see the fundamental aspects of the religious society of the Friends of Truth. The two fundamental aspects are truth and accountability. And I'm not quite sure where that fit into what you were talking about.
Okay. So I suppose truth for me would come through discerning faithfully. And also in that sense of experience of the Spirit, that we are offered truths if if we can get to that place, things are revealed to us. I mean, Fox said he thought he might become a doctor because he could see how everything was and he could name everything. Accountability, I think, is in not imagining we can go it alone. Whether it's being accountable to our meeting or to small groups of personal Quaker friends. So one of the things, I mean, I have, done ridiculous things over vehicles in terms of money and stuff in the past. So one of the things I do is often tell people now what my commitments are, so that next time I mention that I'm thinking about, or I'm looking at an advertisement, they say, but Ben, you said you weren't going to do that anymore. And then I know I'm in real trouble when I'm not even sharing that information. So, but we can be accountable to each other in ways. We are trying to do the same, head in the same direction, hopefully. And again, the answers won't be the same for everybody. But if we have a problem, in my mind, it's that we are not sharing enough about our spiritual life, and we're not sharing enough often about our personal challenges and difficulties. So, and what I've found over time is that sharing my mess does help other people share their mess, and has helped newcomers realize that we're not all like these perfect, polished Quakers, who seem to have ideal lives. Because it's very easy to come to meeting, you see people who, seem to have it all settled and sorted, and then after worship, we talk about a concert or a radio program or something, and it can look a little unreal and daunting. And, people say, I'm not good enough to be a Quaker. And for me, I'm a Quaker because I'm not good enough. I need that accountability and support. So again, we're not a DIY religion, we're a do-it-together one. Okay, we have a few more minutes. Are anyone who hasn't spoken would like to say something? Or? Yes, Tom.
Was there anything in your childhood or early adolescence that you think later influenced you to move toward Quakerism? And where did you grow up? And in what as a small child, and in what circumstances?
Okay, thanks, Tom. Lois, I can see that, and I'll get to it. Thank you. So I grew up with very strict atheist parents. My dad was intellectually an atheist, my mother emotionally. So my mother had a very difficult time in the name of religion. I grew up in the very north of England, and there was a Quaker school. So there was a choice between a Catholic school and a Quaker school out of the independent schools that my parents were considering. And they sent me to the Quaker one, thinking it'd do me less harm religiously than the Catholic one. And I mean, you know, later that was very disappointing for my mother, that maybe the strategy had backfired. So from the age of 11, I was coming across Quakers, not very many at the school, but, you know, it was different from the school I'd been at before. We talked to each other by first names. There were boys and girls there. I hadn't really come across a girl before. And there was no caning. So, you know, we weren't hit if we did something wrong. And so I suppose, you know, I was getting some messages about Quakerism, not necessarily spiritually, but I was seeing a way of being in community.
I see.
Yeah. So that I think that set me on the path. Lewis, the Seekers. So the Seekers were a group of people in the late 1640s and 1650s who had broken away from organized religion, who had become very clear that the church had got it wrong, and they took everything out of the services. And they sat in silence, but they did appoint a minister. Some of the Quakers who had been Seekers later criticized the Seekers because they didn't really know what to do next. And again, Francis Haugill, who I mentioned, talks about God sending one of 10,000 who was to lead the way. And that's George Fox. And he was able to take his sense of the Spirit and have a vision of what that could mean for the people of England, what it would look like as a new church. And then those Seekers were able to become Quakers, and others just stayed, and those groups generally in the end disbanded. But many Seekers became Quakers, but they were at a kind of impasse. They didn't quite know what the next step was. And Fox and the other leaders come along and say, this is the next step. It's called Quakerism. So we need big kettle drums, you know, it's kind of boom, 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 boom. Anyway, great. So I'd like to say, I'd like to thank you again for inviting me. I'd like to recommend that if you're interested in knowing more about Quakerism, you might look at the Woodbrook courses that are on offer, most of which are online. We try and timetable them so they're not in the middle of the night for people in the United States. And also to please be in touch if you want to be. I'm very easily found. Lois has my email address, but you know, if you Google Pink Dandelion email, there's not so many of us that come up. So please do be in touch if you want to follow up on anything at a later time.